Thank you for listening to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. To send me an email, please use rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com, and to send me a message on WhatsApp, +60 16 425 6301. Hello and welcome to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. My name is Keith Hockton. I'm a public historian, author, and broadcaster. I absolutely love math. And I love math for its inherent beauty and elegance that can be found in its patterns, logic, and I love the precise language it provides for us to understand the universe. I get it. In my mind, math offers a sense of clarity, and certainly in a world often filled with ambiguity, it empowers individuals to solve complex problems, to make predictions, and uncover the fundamental truths about the natural world. There isn't anything I don't like about it. It's one of those things that actually really excites me. There's also the satisfaction of arriving at a solution after grappling with a challenging problem. It brings a sense of accomplishment and intellectual fulfillment, no matter how simple or complex, the mathematical problem. And whether it's through its practical application or its abstract concepts, math has a universal appeal, I think, that transcends cultural boundaries. I've also been traveling a bit lately and reading a lot as I travel. And as I was in that kind of traveling mode, I started reading books on utopias. I kind of see them popping up more now than I ever did before. And that also led me to asking the question, why? Yes, the world is in a weird space. And look, I have friends who are way more connected to the planet than I am, who speak of massive changes about to take place. And I respect that they think that they know that. I don't have that particular connection or wisdom, but I respect that they do. So look, for those of you not familiar with a utopia, I'll explain my version of that to you. And look, here's the thing. I'm going to be talking about utopias and Pythagoras. So I'm assuming that you're either interested in utopias and or Pythagoras, or that you already know about them. But I'll explain it to you anyway. A utopia refers to an imagined or an idealized community or society where everything is absolutely perfect, harmonious, and ideal. And it's often depicted as a place or state of existence characterized by social, political, and economic perfection, where there is equality, justice, peace, and happiness for all members. Doesn't that sound fantastic? However, utopias, in my opinion, are generally considered to be unattainable or impractical in reality due to the complexities of man, of human nature, and societal dynamics. But there is light at the end of this tunnel, guys, so please stick with me. So I thought I'd share some thoughts on the history of utopian attempts that have been made, that have actually been put into practice to create a better world, to create different kinds of societies which are not marked by brutal economic inequality, punishment, rule, and rulers. And these utopias seem to have some interesting things in common, no matter where they occur in time or space on the planets, and they pop up everywhere in different periods of time. They pool resources. They think about raising children communally, and they broaden the definition of a family and friends of community. So I just finished reading a book by Christian Gozzi, an American ethnographer. She's also professor of Russian and Eastern European studies at the University of Pennsylvania. The book is called Everyday Utopia. Like I said, I literally just finished it. I've been traveling a bit, and I'll try and pick up a few of her other books because I really loved it. But based on what I'm reading, I'm going to take you right back to the beginning of where the first utopia was established by Pythagoras. That's right, Mr. Triangle himself. You might think he's just a mathematician, but no, he's a lot more than that. So folks, get ready for a cool ride. I think it's one of those really kind of crazy stories when you think back to somebody like Pythagoras, for instance. How many of us learn about him in school, but we very rarely think of Pythagoras outside of the Pythagorean theorem. We think about the triangle, but we don't learn that he was actually the great-great-grandfather of Utopia. And he was absolutely a political thinker. And actually, the books that we have, there's a lot of weird sources, and most of the surviving literature that we have about, his life and his way of life, because he wasn't just a philosopher. He was kind of like what we think of today as a guru. So his theorem, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I hope I get this right because I'm doing it from memory, is a fundamental principle in geometry. Named after him, of course. It states that in a right-angled triangle, the square of the length of the hypotenuse, which is the side opposite the right angle, is equal to the sum of the squares of the lengths of the other two sides. God, I hope I got that right. But he had like a way of life. He had a community. He had a way of being in the world that he thought would actually make us better human beings and better able to understand the mysteries of mathematics in the universe. And most of the sources that we have are actually 800 years after he died. So look, we don't know everything about him, but we have some really, really good evidence that he lived in a very utopian way. And essentially what we would call today in the modern world a commune. He probably is one of the first people in the world to have created a proper functioning commune. Okay, so where was he from? He was actually known as Pythagoras of Samos, which is a Greek island in the Eastern Aegean Sea. And look, he was very unhappy with the way his life was going. And so he and some of his followers left mainland Greece and they settled in a little seaside village in what is now southern Italy. But then it was actually part of larger Greece, and it was called Croton or Croton. And he started this community, and they had these really weird, for that time, quite progressive policies about how they should live together that were really out of the vibe of mainstream Greek way of life. And so lots of people during his lifetime, his contemporaries, but also many, many people after him were like, wow, he actually did some really weird progressive things. Like, he treated women as equals. They shared property in common, and they thought differently about traditional family forms. And so many of the ideas that the Pythagoreans had at that particular time, and we're talking 570 to 495 BC, they look remarkably progressive from our perspective today. Also, coming up that colonial point, but I guess it's a golden age of utopias because there's lots of people setting out to lands that they can just claim and build on and occupy, and they're able to come up with different forms of government. They can choose oligarchies, they can choose tyrannies or double democratic experiments. They can pretty much do whatever the hell they want, and that's exactly what Pythagoras did. And look, you have to get away from mainstream society to do this, which is exactly what he was doing. He wanted to create a radically egalitarian community, quite frankly, again, which was really inclusive of women. And get this, the world's first known named mathematician, Tiana, was a Pythagorean. And we know from sources that came after that, her own writing and works were completely contemporary with them. So it's really weird to have a woman at this stage who's considered a sage, a wise woman, who had things to say about mathematics in the universe because she happened to be part of this really weird experimental community. And I love that. So effectively, the minute women were able to participate in mathematics, you immediately discover there's a female genius out there. I mean, in this particular time in Greece, so we're talking 5 centuries BC, women were just basically baby-making machines. Nobody thought that women had brains, and certainly that they had brains that were capable of this level of, serious mathematical inquiry. So Pythagoras and his community were incredibly ahead of his time. And it's not just Pythagoras, but because of his life, because of his influences like, Plato in the Republic, Plato is also quite proto-feminist. He believes that women can also be the guardians of his ideal city of Callipolis, which is probably the world's first sort of written about utopia. And it's very clear, we know from the 3rd century AD philosopher Iamocles, that Plato was deeply inspired by the Pythagorean way of life. And that's actually how we know about it, because he wrote about it. But this is interesting because this is a utopia. This is not an intellectual experiment, a written experiment. This is really happening on the ground. there's this remarkable woman who's becoming this great mathematician in a society that had never existed before. I mean, this is a new way of ordering our society. And I think that, one of the really key things here is that these are people who owned all of their property in common. So there is actually a saying among the Pythagoreans, which is, among friends, all things together. All things in common. So they didn't believe in private property. And this is really out of step with that particular period of time in antiquity. So here are a group of people, if you wanted to apply a contemporary term to them, they were sort of ancient hippies. We all kind of think of hippies coming around in the 50s and 60s, but no, this happened 2,500 years ago. They were like this weird, nerdy, mathematical hippies who went off and sort of formed this community, very far away from mainstream society, where they basically, because it was easier for them to survive if they shared their property in common, and that they had, a really open mind about, women participating and about what the goal of life was, rather than just getting money. It was obviously to seek knowledge. That's the most important thing. And let's just take a short break for a message from our sponsor. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Autonomous or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270, or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we are back. Some people say that Pythagoras is like the father of Greek philosophy. And it's complicated because we don't have all the sources that we want. But on a day-to-day level, these are actually people who ate their meals together every single day. They basically could have lived in a college dorm. And we might think of it in that way because it's easier for us to conceptualize it in that way. And so it's really remarkable to go back in history and realize that there were these communities, and really important communities, that decided to live in a very different way from the mainstream of their society. And they did that. And they made that decision because there was something valuable, very valuable, about making that decision. There was something about creating these communities that helped them thrive. And I think we can learn so much by going back and actually looking at these different kinds of communities, because some of the lessons they teach us are really applicable in the present day. And I want to make a comment that makes me sound like a social Darwinist, so I apologize here. But the first question that I had when I started this research was, why haven't we heard of Croton before? If it was so successful and so wonderful, why did it not expand and extend and take over from the dominant forms of, gender relations and property ownership that we've actually come to recognize, within the ancient world? So the answer that I came to was, anytime people decide to do things outside of the mainstream, there's always a massive backlash from the mainstream. And the fact that we know about Pythagoras and the Pythagorean way of life shows that it was a really important social experiment. But, most of us have what social psychologists call status quo bias. We don't like to change things. We don't like to shake things up. And I know people out there who aren't those people, and I admire them greatly. So I think it's really important, even though we don't learn about Pythagoras, I think it's quite intentional that we only learn about Pythagorean theorem. We don't actually get to learn about the conditions under which his community was produced. And I think that's really intentional. I mean, the man wants us to know how to work out the area of a triangle, but the man doesn't want us to hear about free love and sharing possessions. And I also think it's really worrying, but I do think that, from the perspective of somebody like me, who's kind of interested in the longer intellectual, genealogical history of utopias, leading up to the present day, basically because of what I've been reading, over the last few years, there is a thread there in a way in which these ideas keep appearing over and over again. And yes, they do get smashed, and, sometimes they get smashed really violently. And I can talk about examples of that. But I will tell you that despite the fact that they are often crushed brutally by the mainstream society, they keep reappearing. They appear cross-culturally and they appear trans-historically. So everywhere we look around the world, there are always utopias living out there on the margins of society and people dreaming about different ways of being in the world, which I think is really, really important. When I was looking at these different utopias, I was also wondering if I had a bias. And were some utopians, kind of crazy people who kept members of the opposite sex enslaved for, sexual purposes, or is there something trans-historical in different places and periods where we feel that we're actually crawling towards, some kind of important truth about property, about our private lives? Or is it everything? Just a whole galaxy of different utopias out there. And I came to the conclusion, I think it depends on how you use the word. Again, I don't want to get into a semantic debate about the word utopia, but in my view, utopia is a very capacious term that basically brings us closer, I think, to our evolutionary anthropological origins. The fact that we were cooperative breeders, the fact that we did in fact tend to be more egalitarian, not completely. There are lots of different examples if you read the books. Like another one that I read last year was the Dawn of Everything by David Wengrow and David Graeber. I think it's David Graeber. You'll know that you can't say anything is natural or unnatural, but there's certainly this deep, long tendency for us to be much more altruistic and communal than we are today. I mentioned, social Darwinism. There's a way in which our economic system is predicated on this idea that we're naturally very Hobbesian and selfish, and that life would be very brutish and nasty and short if we didn't actually have some kind of sovereign to, rule over us and guarantee our rights to property and so on and so forth. I think there's so much archaeological and anthropological evidence right now, and writers are adding to this, all the time. There's a lot of historical evidence that shows, that throughout history, there have been these amazing communities that have said, no, the way that you're organizing property and the way that you're organizing gender relations and the way that you're organizing the family, all of that is just completely wrong. And it's actually hurting and hurtful to human beings. And there's a whole other way of living. And sometimes those narratives are religious. I just want to make it very clear that we can talk about both secular and spiritual communities, because I think the spiritual communities are really important, because some people think about communes and they only think about secular communes. And monasticism sounds very similar to that. And I think a lot of especially contemporary visions of communal living actually come out of monasticism. So if you think about, university dorms and boarding schools, which of course I attended, they're totally modeled on monastic living. So there's all sorts of residences, both spiritually and from a secular point of view. Okay, so then I wondered, what else defines utopias? I've talked about sort of living in communities, so, not being isolated in detached houses surrounded by lawn, wilting under the hot sun, a communal form of living, a form of shared property. That's also important, but what else? Shared properties are important. Also a commitment to what I would call collective child rearing, or, community child rearing, or, cooperative breeding. There's all sorts of different words that gets used for this, but like even in monastic communities where people have, where people are celibates, Benedictine monks, for instance, or Benedictine cloisters, or, people who are celibate tend to take in orphans or otherwise unwanted children, born out of wedlock, for instance, or they take in women who get pregnant out of wedlock. I mean, they raise children and they raise those children collectively. They don't raise them in this kind of isolated, nuclear family. And so if we think about the history of the West, there's this really interesting way, I think, in which we organize our domestic sphere, which I'm now going to be calling utopian. I identify it as a certain idea about the dwellings within which we live. The way we own property, the way we raise our children, and the way we imagine our social networks. So rather than focusing on the nuclear family, thinking of those as more capacious, this can mean aunts and uncles. This can mean godparents. This could mean your neighbors, your colleagues and your friends. This could be your fellow monastics. I mean, I'm thinking very capaciously about what people today might call their chosen family, for instance. But I think there's a great story here, which is that there are ordinary, when we think about the past, we often think about individuals because we read history as the story of certain individuals who did certain things often. But what I'm calling utopia, and I want to make it very clear that for me, utopia is never going to be somebody who's like a charismatic leader or leading some kind of cult or, something like that where, people can't leave. I'm talking about voluntary societies, fairly egalitarian communities where people join and they're finding something very satisfying about the way these people are living together and sharing property and sharing ideals of family in common. And their day-to-day life means having meals with other people, sharing chores or doing work together, taking care of each other's children, like doing things in a way that really prioritize cooperation and the connection over competition and private wealth accumulation. That's what I mean. And that is a story of history that we very rarely hear about. And so I think it's really important that we learn about it when we can, as often as we can. And then during this research, I came across bogomilism. So this is one of the examples of a very spiritual community. And the Bogomils, as they're known, are a fascinating group of people. I'd never heard of them before, but I was completely taken by their story. And they were from the 9th and 10th century in what was then the first Bulgarian kingdom. And they also had some deeper roots in the Ottoman Empire, but they really start to gain traction in Bulgaria in the Middle Ages. And I've read so much about them, but I like to call them asexual vegan anarchists. Because if you actually spend some time looking at what the Bogomils believed and also their reaction against them, they were really interesting in the sense that they believed that the material world was actually the work of the devil. And they were also Manichaeans, so they were dualists. They were a dualist sect which believed that there was a God in heaven that was in charge of the spiritual realm, but that there was also a God on earth who was in charge of all material things. Two separate people, and that God on earth was basically the devil. So they thought that humans were actually angels whose spirits had been trapped in material form. And so because angels were pure spirit, they believed that the spirit was then sexless. And so they allowed women to become the highest spiritual leaders among them. And that's really profound. And these female spiritual leaders were called perfecti. And the idea was that as you got close to death, there was this ritual that was actually performed called the consolation. And then it's almost like kind of a Western form of Buddhism. Rather than being reincarnated in the physical flesh at some point, your spirit would then be free. And people who had reached this state, which is really very similar to what we would call enlightenment in Buddhism, you could then choose to remain on earth as a perfect person and help other people reach their state of pure spirit. Now, here's the thing. Christianity at this point was huge and very, very powerful. And they were kicked out of Bulgaria because, well, there's a great quote from the Middle Ages. And this is from a medieval Bulgarian priest. And this is his actual quote about the Bogomils. He said, "They teach their followers not to obey their masters. They scorn the rich, they hate the czars, and they ridicule their superiors. They reproach the nobles, and they believe that God looks in horror on those who labor for the czars and advise every serf not to work for his master." So you can imagine how unpopular they were and how unwelcome they were. So they got kicked out. So they settled for a while in Bosnia and then moved into northern Italy, where we actually came to know them as the Cathars. And ultimately, they move into southern France, where they are then known, or they become known as the Albigensians. And then they're just completely and utterly destroyed in the Albigensian crusade of the early 13th century by the Catholic Church. And then the last few remaining ones that survived the crusade are all murdered in the future Inquisitions. And I think this is interesting. Some people actually call them proto-Protestants. And so a lot of people will actually argue, theologians argue that the Protestant Reformation would never have happened had it not been for this earlier spiritual, kind of quote unquote heresies of the Bocomiles and the Cathars and the Albigensians. And there's a moment, when the papal legate, a Catholic establishment figure, actually says, kill them all. God will actually know his own. This is an astoundingly brutal statement to make. So what he actually does is he orders the murder of this entire society. And his soldiers go out and they murder the men, the women, the children, and the Catholics, basically everybody, because that quote that he made, he's actually saying, well, we actually don't know among the Cathars who's not a Catholic. So just kill them all. But don't worry about it because God will know. And that's what they do. They go out and they massacre every single Cathar. The word genocide gets thrown around a lot. And there are some people that say that the Albigensian Crusade by the Catholic Church was one of the first ideological genocides where every single member of this particular group, the Cathars, who believed in, this theology of dualism, were literally just murdered. If these utopias seem to be closer to our natural state of being, we can assume they're enjoyed and they nourish the people within them and they thrive. What is it about our nature that makes the alternatives? Like, how did the property and the violence and the alcohol actually hack our brains and make us who we are? It seems absolutely crazy. Well, in theory it does, but it doesn't seem that crazy when you understand this longer sweep of history. And I think some people will say, how can you talk about these utopian communities as being really important to human history? And I would actually argue that they're essential. What makes us human, what makes us thrive as a species are these utopian communities, because it's from these communities that we get so many of our ideas. When we face challenges, particularly environmental or geographic or political or economic challenges, we turn to these utopians. And we hope that they have something to tell us. These blue sky thinking dreamers out there. But I will say that early Buddhists, early followers of the Buddha, and pre-325 Christians, so before Christianity effectively became a state, religion under Constantine, all of them, I think, are 100% utopian communities. They were really marginal in the societies within which they existed. And if you look at those communities today, there are 1.2 billion Catholics alone. That's not Christians, that's just Catholics. And both Christianity and Buddhism are major world religions. So these ideas exist parallel to us. The problem is, I think, that we have been seduced, especially those of us living in the global north and the UK and the US, probably the worst offenders in this sense, to think of self-sufficiency and kind of private wealth accumulation and this sort of idea of the nuclear family, with biparental care for your own biological children in your single family homes, surrounded by hordes of your own privately owned stuff. Like, that's kind of the ideal that we have. And yet it's completely incongruous with the way that we have actually evolved. So how were we so completely led astray? And I think the reason we're so led astray, look, I think there's lots of reasons, but I think that this thing is that everything about the way we live, about your house, think about if you want to buy a house or if you want to rent an apartment, they're all single family homes. How are we actually going to move into that with 4 other people? Think about the way we organize our families. Most birth certificates only allow 2 parents. So it's very different to think about a more capricious parenting unit that might include grandparents or aunts and uncles or godparents or whatever. There's an entire legal structure in place. There's an entire built environment. There's an entire ideology around individual acquisition that pushes us into thinking that there's a certain way of living your life. And I think that if you look at utopian communities that exist today, and there are many that exist today, by the way, all over the world, eco-villages and international communities and, all sorts of living places where people are actually trying to bring these ideas back to life. And I love that, particularly to combat the isolation and loneliness that I think is so pervasive in our societies, particularly to reduce our carbon footprint. What's not to love about that? For environmental reasons, living together and sharing resources and certainly sharing heating and cooling and in a dwelling is actually really efficient. And I also think there's a way that living this way also helps us deal with inequality. We live in societies, you, me, where 60% of wealth is inherited. So organizing our domestic lives can have really important and profound effects on the world in which we live. But it's also a threat. It's a huge threat to the prevailing economic system within which we live that wants to come to modify our relationships and so on and so forth. So I think it just takes time. And it's not just me. I think there's a lot of people who are really interested in these ideas. They just don't have the deeper history and the experiences. People like Pythagoras and Tiana or Plato or Thomas More, all of these different experiments and imaginations that people have learned and not learned over time. And there's a really important thread, I think, and I know I'm off at a tangent here, folks, but I think it makes sense. I think there's a really important thread that connects us to this more natural way of living. And they think that studying these utopian communities really helps us understand that thread. And that might sound a little bit weird, but if we got the opportunity over the next 200 years, when we talk about, settling Mars and, we talk about settling the moon, I wonder if this conversation that I'm having with you needs to be part of that thought process. And I think if Elon Musk is listening to this, it's not just the technology that will allow us to get there. I'm so fascinated by how we are going to choose to organize ourselves when we get there. And I think we don't need to export the model that is dominant on Earth at this particular moment in time. And I think that, if we do think about settlements on the moon or settlements on Mars or settlements on asteroids or spaceships, that are going to be traveling, satellites that are going to be orbiting the planet, we have the ability to reorganize the way that we live, the way that we think of family, the way we identify kin. And there's an absolutely wonderful word in English called kith. This term, kith and kin, your kith are actually the people that are your comrades, your colleagues, your neighbors, your friends. And kith were actually really important. There were kinfolk and there used to be this word kithfolk. And I think if we're going to be on Mars at some point, and there's some really great evolutionary, biological, and anthropological evidence that shows that in extreme environments, in high altitudes, for instance, in the extremes of temperature, other planets, there's a lot of research being done with NASA, for instance, that when we're actually strained biologically as human beings, we have like biological limits, to the temperatures, for instance, or biological limits to the lack of gravity or the lack of oxygen that we can endure. When we're actually under stress, you can actually take saliva samples and test things like, cortisol and testosterone. And it shows that when we are under an incredible amount of stress, two things happen. One, we burn way more calories, so we become less efficient. And second of all, it compromises our neuroendocrine system. So it actually makes us less able to move through space in a very graceful way. And the only thing that mitigates against both of these effects, you guessed it, it's being with other people. Loners won't survive. So as we're on a planet where our environment is going to be more hostile to our biology in the future, and if we're going to settle other planets, or we're going to be in space in any way, the most important thing that we need to survive, literally to biologically thrive in these environments, is other people. So I think we really need to think, and we need to look at these longer, deeper historical experiments, like Pythagoras, did 2,500 years ago, about how we can live together in harmony with each other and with nature. And I think that what the long history of Utopia shows us is that it's totally possible. So we should all be reading as much about this as we can. And it's like, if you're on a space shuttle to Mars, we need to actually be thinking about this longer history of how we can live together in harmony with each other. I actually think it's really inspiring stuff. I think looking at utopias and what Pythagoras created is incredibly inspiring, and that he actually tried that 2,500 years ago just blows my mind. And I think now, when I'm actually at my happiest, I'm at my happiest when I'm with close friends and family, when I'm with a wider group of my kith and my kin. And I think anecdotally, that's true. I don't have to go to Mars and experience my biological limits to work that one out. So there you go, guys. Some thoughts on Utopia and Pythagoras. Thank you very much for joining this podcast. I hope you enjoyed what I had to say. If you have any questions, get in contact with me. I love getting your mail and listening to what you have to say, and also suggestions for other shows. So send your emails to rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com, and I'll look forward to chatting to you again next week. Bye for now.